So I'm going to expand on what I was talking about earlier in terms of how we designed surveys. And the exact wording of a question really matters. So this section is about watching your language. So one of the pitfalls that you can encounter is using what we call a double-barreled question. So this is a question that actually is asking two things instead of one. And we also have to be careful about that. This is an example. Do you believe that we are spending too much money on the military and should spend more on education? So this is a problem. So what if you believe, answering this question, that we spend too much money on the military, but you don't believe we should spend more on education? How do you answer this question? It would be better if this was two questions. So we have to be very careful that we are only asking about one thing at a time with each question that we write. We also have to be very careful about using leading or loaded questions. This is a question actually written by Karl Marx. He was trying to survey employees, and he asked whether or not people's employers resorted to trickery in order to defraud you of a part of your earnings. So using words like trickery or resorting to, defrauding, these are very loaded words, so we have to be careful with the kinds of language that we use in asking questions, particularly if it seems like our question is pushing the respondent to a particular answer. We also have to be very, very careful about our use of always, never, negatives, and double negatives. This can be very confusing for people asking a survey. So these are two survey questions actually administered by the Roper Center in the 1980s. And the first one, when they administered it, they found the results very disturbing. So the question was, does it seem possible or does it seem impossible to you that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? So the combination here of possible or impossible and never happened confused a lot of the people that answered this question. So 65% said it was impossible that it never happened. So saying they were pretty certain that the Holocaust happened. 12% said they don't know, and then 22% said possible it never happened. So the press releases around this particular survey said, oh my goodness, so many people in the US now believe that it was unlikely that the Holocaust happened. Well, the problem is that it had to do with the wording of the question. When they asked it again the next year, they said, does it seem possible to you that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened, or do you feel certain that it happened? 91% said it was certain that it happened, and 8% said they don't know. Only 1% said it was possible that it never happened. This is a big difference. So what we find is that whether or not there's support, for example, for government action around something depends on how we ask about it. So there's always more support for assistance to the poor and less support for welfare. There's always more support for halting the rising crime rate and less support for law enforcement. So the words we use really matter. And one way of getting around this is particularly if you're using language that is very, it's hard to find neutral language around something. Asking a question in multiple different ways to see if support changes. So for example, between 1940 and 1975, attitudes towards free speech against democracy really changed, but it depended on how you asked about it. If you asked about whether or not they should not allow speeches, more people said they were in favor of that. So they were in favor of not allowing certain kinds of speeches. But if you phrased it in terms of forbidding speeches, so you changed the verb, the support declines. There's also issues what we call over-reporting and under-reporting. So people tend to over-report things that are considered to be socially approved of. So more people say they vote than actually vote, and more people say they go to church than actually go to church. If you ask people about whether or not they recycle on a regular basis, most people would say that they do, even when they don't. We've also found that men tend to over-report the number of sexual partners that they have. People tend to under-report behaviors or attitudes that are considered less socially acceptable. So for example, racist attitudes, the use of illicit drugs, whether or not they've had an abortion, whether or not they've been a crime victim or engaged in crime themselves. One of the ways that we can deal with this is in how we write questions. So for example, it's very, very common to have what we call cushioning language or softening language around more socially desirable behaviors. Right? So when talking to people about elections, we often find that a lot of people were not able to vote because they were not registered, they were sick, or they just didn't have the time. How about you? Did you vote in the elections this November? So this decreases the chance that you're going to get over-reporting for voting. So it's really important how we think about kind of these issues when we design questions.